Okay, let's dive right into this fascinating explainer. Today, we're unpacking a really complex narrative surrounding one of the most recognizable figures in sports history. We are looking at the massive disconnect between Conor McGregor's global brand and his stark reality at home. It's essentially a story of two entirely different McGregors, totally depending on which side of the Atlantic you're standing on. So here's the big question. How does a man who is literally cheered by millions impact arenas, a guy who gets hosted on American late night television, become simultaneously, thoroughly, and systematically rejected by his own home country? Well, the answers we found in the source material are pretty staggering. Section 1. The Comeback Machine, Building an Empire Outside the Cage. During his 5-year absence from athletic competition, McGregor didn't exactly just fade away. He basically transformed into a corporate machine. He aggressively expanded his business portfolio to keep his name front and center. We're talking about becoming a part owner of the Bare Knuckle Fighting Championship, stepping into Hollywood for the Amazon Prime remake of Roadhouse, heavily pushing his forged Irish Stout and proper No 12 whiskey, and even signing a massive global brand ambassador deal with the online sportsbook 1xBet. He was literally everywhere, except inside the octagon. And he brought this incredible, raw enthusiasm to these new ventures. When he announced his surprise BKFC co-ownership during a pay-per-view broadcast, he actually declared to President David Feldman that they were in the big leagues. It was a move that really signaled McGregor was looking to position himself not just as a fighter, but as a legitimate power broker and a potential rival to the UFC's dominance in combat sports down the line. His crossover into Hollywood was just as loud. Starring alongside Jake Gyllenhaal was a huge move for his brand. But as it turns out, the experience wasn't exactly what he expected. He later admitted to the media that he's unlikely to act again simply because the schedule was incredibly grueling. Interestingly enough, during this exact same period, he expressed immense frustration with the UFC. He pointed out a real lack of transparency regarding his return date, which led to wasted training camps in Cannes and Dubai. That frustration caused him to momentarily lose interest in fighting and focus heavily on all these other business ventures. Section 2. Pariah in Ireland, the stark reality at home. Now, what's really interesting here is the complete 180-degree turn when we look at his reception in Ireland. While he was out building that global empire, his standing at home basically collapsed in a rapid sequence of events. Back in November 2023, police examined his social media posts during the Dublin riots after he declared, "Ireland, we are at war." Fast forward a year to November 2024, a civil jury finds him liable for sexual assault. By April 2025, a teased run for the Irish presidency polled at a dismal 7%. And then in July 2025, his appeal in the civil case was entirely dismissed. The most severe shift happened in November 2024. A civil jury at Ireland's High Court found McGregor liable for sexual assault against Nikita Hant, awarding her nearly €250,000 in damages. Now, Hant's testimony was described in the reports as harrowing. McGregor has maintained his innocence throughout all of this, stating the encounter was consensual and he fought the verdict hard. However, the court subsequently dismissed his appeal entirely. The judges awarded Hant costs at the highest level, declaring she had been completely vindicated, and they even formally expressed displeasure at McGregor's public attacks on the verdict. So the really crucial takeaway here is that the reaction in Ireland was swift, and it wasn't just some online criticism. It was a tangible, nationwide commercial and political boycott. Major retailers like Tesco and Musgrave completely pulled his alcohol brands from over 1,000 outlets. When he was shouted out at a Limp Bizkit concert in Dublin, the hometown crowd booed him. And when he tried to pivot to politics, teasing that run for the presidency, 134 parliamentarians explicitly refused to nominate him, forcing him to withdraw entirely by September 2025. To understand exactly how fiercely the Irish political establishment rejected him, just listen to what one anonymous Irish parliamentarian told Sky News. They said there was not a hope in hell, calling him a misogynist and a thug. The sentiment at home was absolute. The country whose flag he draped over his shoulders for a decade had just thoroughly turned its back on him. Section 3. The American Embrace, a different reception across the Atlantic. And this perfectly illustrates the central paradox we're looking at. In Ireland, the reality was retail boycotts, single-digit polling, and complete national rejection. Yet across the Atlantic, McGregor was sitting on Jimmy Fallon's couch, starring in slick CBS Sports comeback promos, and getting the full-blown celebrity treatment. The American sports and media apparatus essentially offered him the appearance of normality. They continued to bank on his superstar status while entirely bypassing the reality of his legal and political standing back in Ireland. The absolute peak of this American embrace came on St. Patrick's Day 2025. McGregor was invited to the White House, posed right there in the Oval Office, and used the platform to make remarks about an illegal immigration racket ravaging Ireland. Now, certain political movements in the U.S. enthusiastically embraced his rhetoric, which aligned perfectly with their own anti-establishment messaging, totally ignoring his legal background. Meanwhile, the Irish Prime Minister immediately and publicly condemned McGregor's remarks as wrong, and stressed they did not reflect the views of the Irish people. Section 4. PEDs and contract delays, the road back to the octagon. Shifting gears back to the sport itself, let's examine the massive hurdles that actually delayed his athletic return. The promotional machine often framed his 5-year absence as just a really long injury layoff, but the timeline is much more complicated than that. He suffered that gruesome leg break in July 2021. He didn't even resume anti-doping testing until October 2023. Then he faced a massive hurdle, an 18-month backdated suspension from combat sports anti-doping, beginning in September 2014. That was due to 3 missed tests, which completely derailed his highly anticipated return against Michael Chandler. He wouldn't step back into the cage until July 2026. And the reason for that massive testing gap? It came down to performance-enhancing drugs. According to reports cited in the sources, McGregor utilized anabolic steroids and human growth hormone during his recovery. Now, both McGregor and the UFC defended their use for his leg recovery. However, sources reported he continued taking them even after the leg healed, simply because, quote, he liked how they made him feel and the energy they gave him. This ultimately played a major role in those missed tests and the subsequent suspension. Now, let's look at the actual business side of his return. McGregor returned under a completely new paradigm for the UFC, a media rights deal with Paramount+. Because numbered events were now tucked behind a subscription wall rather than the old pay-per-view model, his legendary PPV point structure just no longer applied. He admitted the newly negotiated flat pay was a juicy one, but he also noted it was likely below his true market value. And significantly, he revealed he only has 2 fights left on this contract: the return at UFC 329 and a tentative final fight scheduled almost a year later for April 2027, a delay he publicly called ridiculous. Section 5, UFC 329, 69 seconds, the anticlimactic return. All right, so we finally arrive at the climax. After 5 long years of waiting, Saturday night at the T-Mobile Arena in Las Vegas, UFC 329, a massive welterweight rematch against Max Holloway, coming exactly 13 years after McGregor defeated a young Holloway back in Boston. The American promotional machine did its job flawlessly. The arena roared, the broadcast was slick, the hype was absolutely deafening, and everyone was ready for this great American comeback story to be written right there in the cage. And then reality hit. 69. That is exactly how many seconds this grand comeback actually lasted. Just over a minute into the first round, McGregor sustained a freak knee injury on a kick. He tried to fight on for a few seconds, looked over to the referee, and the fight was waved off. 5 years of waiting, endless hype, and the whole shebang was over in 69 seconds. Yet, the machine never really stops. Despite the absolute anticlimax of the evening, his opponent, Max Holloway, was already laying the groundwork for the next chapter. He was immediately talking about sitting down with the UFC to run it back one more time. Because in the business of combat sports, as long as the hype exists, there is absolutely always another fight to sell. So it all leaves us with a massive question. After a 5-year athletic void filled with huge business expansions, severe civil legal judgments, absolute national rejection at home, and a comeback that ended in just 69 seconds, what exactly is the true legacy of the UFC's biggest star? Can the global comeback machine continue to outrun the reality of the pariah forever? Thanks for joining me on this deep dive, and keep questioning the narratives behind the superstars.